For my own part, I was asked to pray with people, and also people were clearly anxious that relatives got news that they were out of the carriages and they were relatively okay.
The sheer scale of this disaster has yet to sink in for many who witnessed the tragedy at close hand.
Yes, Katie Oscoff reporting more from Katie and from John Hill at the scene later in the programme. But now let's cross to Pontefract General Infirmary, where the largest number of injured train passengers were ferried in a fleet of ambulances. At the hospital, Calendar's Chris Kiddy. Chris.
Yes, I'm here at the infirmary with Mike Playforth. Mike, what's happened today exactly?
Well, we got a call at 7:20 this morning to say there'd been a major road rail accident with an unknown number of casualties. So we introduced our MAJAX plan and called in staff to manage a major incident. And during the following 2 hours, 31 patients were brought here with a result of their injuries. 8 of whom actually got very serious injuries. One required an operation here for bleeding internally and is now on the intensive care unit. Another person has serious chest injuries and is on our intensive care unit here. 3 other patients have had to be transferred to St James's Hospital with a combination of spinal injuries and serious pelvic fracture. One person's gone to Leeds General Infirmary with a serious chest injury. One further patient's to Pinderfield with a serious facial bone fracture.
You have a major accident plan, obviously. Did it go according to plan?
It did indeed. It went very smoothly indeed. Everybody performed very professionally. All the people who should have turned up to do their job did, and did very well, and I think we should all be very grateful for the way people are responding to this emergency.
We know about the injuries. What sort of condition were the people in themselves? Very shocked, I would think.
Very, very shocked. I don't think I've seen people quite so quiet. They had, although the ones who were relatively minorly injured, they were sort of nasty cuts and broken bones, but they were very, very quiet, obviously very, very stunned. I think the cold and the fact it was a train accident has been very stunning for them.
So how many remain here tonight?
We've got a total of 15, 2 of whom are on the intensive care unit.
How serious are they, Mike?
Well, to them, they're very serious. They have really quite extensive wounds to their scalps and limbs and 1 or 2 fractures. But none of them are the ones on the main wards I think are life-threatening. Though they will remain under observation and be reviewed again thoroughly in the morning to make sure that all the injuries have been correctly treated.
Have you had to deal with this kind of thing at all in your career before?
Yes. I've been a consultant here since 1991. And when I was appointed, I was told that once in a consultant's career of 20 years you'd see a major incident. This is in fact the 3rd that I've been involved with here, so unfortunately these are becoming more frequent.
But things went smoothly.
Things went very, very smoothly. We have a well-written MAJAX plan which is re-looked at every year, and areas of it are tested, as well as the tests have actually been through in reality in this hospital.
Mike, thank you very much indeed. From Pontefract, it's back to you in the studio in Leeds.
Well, thanks to Chris Kiddy. Well, earlier this afternoon, the Deputy Prime Minister, John Prescott, travelled from London to meet with emergency workers and inspect the crash site. And this is what he had to say.
Well, it's clearly a terrible tragedy, and our thoughts at the moment must be with those that have been wounded and injured in this situation, and also those to the relatives of those that have died. A full assessment of that is being made, and a statement will be made later. We obviously admire the great professionalism of our rescue services and emergency services. They're doing a tremendous job here under the most difficult of circumstances, but as far as we're aware, most people have now been removed from the site who are travelling or involved in this tragedy. I have asked the Health and Safety Executive to do me a quick and interim report, because there are many agencies that are involved in this situation, and I will be making a statement about whatever actions I take later. I shall be making a statement to the House at 7 o'clock this evening, and then I shall give a fuller statement, and then that's where we are.
Any indications, Mr. Prescott, that you can give us about how this might have happened? Obviously very early days.
No, it wouldn't be right to speculate about that at the moment. Of course, I've heard the interpretations given by the various agencies here, but it was triggered off, of course, by a car coming up on the motorway. But I don't want to say any more than that. There are people looking at that. Hopefully I might be able to say a little bit more at 7 o'clock. But you can imagine it takes a few days to get a proper and interim report, and that will be given to me by the Health and Safety Executive in the next few days. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
afternoon, well actually just minutes before the accident, the 4:45 a.m. train, which was travelling from Newcastle through to London, had just departed from York Station. At the station today, there was shock and disbelief among commuters there. The crash has disrupted services all day along the main East Coast line, yet another blow for an already beleaguered railway system. But as Georgia Webber reports, most passengers at York today felt sadness rather than anger.
It was an unnervingly quiet scene at York Station. Passengers turned away as news filtered through of the crash and trains to London were cancelled. But questions are already being asked as to how a vehicle came through barriers on the M62 motorway, ending up on rail tracks in front of the train.
There are issues there that clearly need to be looked at in terms of ensuring that road vehicles can't get off the motorway or trunk road system and go onto railway lines.
The express train passed through York at 6 o'clock this morning on its way to London, when it collided soon after with a vehicle and a freight train at Great Heck between Selby and York, killing at least 13 people and injuring more than 70.
Tragic, amazing. We can't believe that this has happened to us. But our prime concern clearly is for those passengers on board the train today.
Well, it's so sad. It's just an accident. Whether it's due to the weather or what, we don't know.
Terrible. Really upset over it. I mean, I saw the news this morning and I don't know, it just seems to happen time and time again. When's it going to stop?
At the moment, it looks like a tragic set of circumstances resulted in today's crash, but no doubt an investigation will ascertain as to how this car came to be in front of a high-speed GNER train.
Georgia Webber reporting from York there. Well, let's go back to the crash site at Great Heck and rejoin our reporter Katie Ostroff. Katie.
Yes, Mike, and as you join us, the members of the emergency services are still working tirelessly in the background as they have been all day, but also working here today sort of quietly and behind the scenes. We've had many members of the clergy. I'm joined by one of them now, the Reverend Cyril Roberts. Your parish includes this tiny village of Great Heck. First of all, what was your personal thoughts when you saw this wreckage at about 7:30 this morning?
Well, I was amazed that people had walked out of it, to be honest. I mean, it is such a scene of devastation that how anyone walked away at all is quite amazing. But miraculously, a large number did, and that's great. Sadly, though, there were quite a large number of people who were moved off to hospital and were seriously injured, and of course there are some fatalities too. So it's a terrible tragedy for us round here.
But you're here to help, and what do you do? Where do you start?
Well, when I arrived this morning, there were people, the people who've been described as the walking wounded were wandering around in the farmyard, and I spent time with some of those. Some of them were just shaking and crying, so I held them, hugged them, spoke to them, listened to them. Then I moved on to the barn, which had been set up as a triage post, and spent time with some of the more seriously injured people. And then the emergency services were absolutely incredible. I mean, I expected chaos, and it was very calm, extremely well organised, and they moved people out to hospitals all over Yorkshire with extraordinary speed and efficiency. I couldn't praise them highly enough, actually. It was quite amazing to see it. And then I actually then got a proper look at the wreckage when things quietened down and the last of the casualties had left the scene. That would be, I don't know. I don't wear a watch, so I can't tell you what time it was, but it was a long time before I took in what had really happened, and then I was horrified. I was with a young woman, I guess about 30 years old, who was in the barn, which was the triage post, and she was probably quite seriously injured. And I was speaking with her and spent quite a lot of time with her. And then when she was lifted into the ambulance, she saw the wreckage that she'd been brought out of as she was going into the ambulance, and she covered her face and broke down. And that was a terrible moment for me. I felt heartbroken for her, really, because...
You must feel quite drained after all you've seen today. Now, I know you've got a service tonight, but what are you going to be saying to people in that service so soon after what's happened?
I'm not actually going to be saying a great deal, because the Bishop of Doncaster has actually very kindly offered to help me out, so he's going to do most of the talking. I seem to have been talking all day. And but I mean, what we will be doing is obviously we'll be talking about what this means, and we'll be talking about the kind of support that we may need to put into the community. I guess some people will be coming back here to the scene of the accident, and my little church at Heck will be open and staffed for the next 2 or 3 days for people who return to the scene.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And we will be going to that church service as well. I know that's where you're off now. So from the scene, it's back to you in the studio.
Yes, thanks very much to Katie there. Well, actually, one of the local residents in Great Heck who saw the horrific scene firsthand this morning was actually Charles Watkinson, and he joins us now in the studio. Charles, I know the first thing that you realised that something was wrong, you heard a rumbling, but that's normal, isn't it? You live near a railway line.
That's right. The rumbling and the shaking of the house was considerably greater than we'd normally get, and I jumped up. I was just getting out of bed, so I was already awake. Jumped up, went to the window, looked out. It was pitch black, so I couldn't see anything. I didn't see any lights on the railway line, which if there had been an accident I would have expected to see. And then I ran and looked through other windows, thinking that maybe a truck had come off as it had gone over the railway bridge, but there was no sign of anything. And so I went and started to get ready for my day. I washed and shaved and put my clothes on. It was only then when I was thinking more clearly that I thought, no, there must have been something happened, and I went outside.
And what met you there was a neighbour of yours who'd been down to the scene and was just completely dazed by what he'd witnessed.
Initially, I went out into my driveway and I saw that there were some railway wagons on the track. I couldn't see the passenger train, and I thought simply that there'd been a goods vehicle derailed, and I rushed back into my house and grabbed a camera. And I then went up onto the railway line, up onto the bridge, where I could see the front end of the freight train, which was in an horrendous mess and was almost in one of my neighbour's buildings.
I mean, it had actually sort of come to the fence, and it was very near the house.
It was so near, and it was so mangled, I couldn't imagine what had happened to it. And it was then that I went and looked over the other side of the bridge,
and it
was then that I realised there was a passenger train, and I just thought, oh my God. It was very traumatic.
I'm sure it was. And one of the things that when we spoke to you this morning, and I do appreciate that you've lived this all day today, and thanks very, very much for coming in. But you couldn't believe how a train, I think John mentioned it in his piece as well, had just disintegrated, almost like matchsticks.
No, I am an engineer, and I could not believe the metal carnage that I met with. It was just absolutely incredible. There were just so many pieces of metal, bogie, wheels, pieces of spring. It was incredible. Although the main part of the train had stayed intact to some extent, the number of pieces, it was like walking in a scrapyard.
Yeah, we can just see them there. I mean, they're so far away from the track as well, aren't they, Charles? I mean, this is what you saw, but in an odd and eerie kind of way. You saw it as the light came up in the morning, and you must have just thought, this is just a terrible nightmare.
You don't actually get a good impression of what has happened when you see those pictures.
It's worse.
If you look in between the carriages, the metal, the destruction is just mind-boggling. That's all I can say.
How have you continued today? I know that you've left the scene, you've come to work in Leeds, which is why you've come to see us. I mean, how have you put one foot in front of the other?
Well, by 8 o'clock I felt there was nothing else I could do, and I reeked of diesel fuel. There was diesel absolutely everywhere. My clothes were covered in it, so I went and got a bath, changed my clothes, and I thought the best thing I can do is keep my mind off it and go to work, and that's what I did. And I have today obviously thought about it many times, but...
and you have to go back to the village, and you will be going back there now.
Indeed.
And you must be almost dreading that.
I'm not looking forward to sleeping next door to that carnage tonight, no.
Charles Watkinson, thank you very much.
Thank you.
An eyewitness to a tragedy there. Well, now let's go over to our man Alan Hardwick. Now, Alan, who has another of Great Heck's residents with him right now.
Well, Nick Vicenti is a former police officer, now owner of the Bay Horse Inn, about half a mile away from the crash scene. You were actually on the scene very quickly. What did you see?
My first visual contact with the scene was the carriages, railway carriages that were twisted and in effect devastated and decimated at the side of the track.
But what about casualties at that time?
Well, on the scene were service personnel, firemen, ambulance crews and police, and they were at the time, they were helping some walking people, and some people were being stretchered away to a nearby farm building.
Now, when you got you were actually phoned. You were told that there had been a collision somewhere near the village. When you got there, what sort of thing did you expect?
Well, with my former training, I thought I would be initially on the scene and I could offer some sort of assistance in assisting people that had been injured. I did obviously expect there would be injuries, but obviously the scene is a lot worse than I thought, and you know it's the scene of twisted metal and railway carriages, and the carnage there was just unbelievable.
Obviously, as a serving officer, you would have been through major incidents before, but obviously, equally obviously, nothing like this.
Nothing to equal this. No, not. I've been to many road accidents and what have you, but this far and away surpasses anything I've seen before.
Nick, for the moment, thanks very much indeed. And now, back to the studio.
Yes, thank you very much, Alan. Well, the train that crashed was heading down the East Coast Line to London's King's Cross. Our reporter David Harrison has been gauging reaction to today's crash in the capital.
Yes, thank you. Well, the mood here at King's Cross Station has been somewhat sombre today. There's been little of the usual hustle and bustle that any regular rail travellers between Yorkshire and London will know of. This is, of course, the station where the derailed passenger train, the 4:45 Newcastle to London commuter service, was destined for. Now, you may be able to see behind me information about the crash was posted early on, and many trains have actually been cancelled. Some passengers who did make it down from Yorkshire to London today spoke to me about their shock on hearing news of the accident.
I was very worrying. I was extremely worried. I was on the train behind it. Yeah.
How does it make you feel about rail safety?
Well, quite worried actually. I'm quite concerned.
Quite surprised about the fact that a car could come off the bridge onto the railway line. It was just a travesty, really.
We were fortunate that we were able to get a lift to Leeds and come down on another train. But we don't know, and we've been on a train for 4 hours, so we don't know any of the updates, but it's a great, great tragedy, and we're all very, very sad.
Horror-stricken, because in fact I was booked on that train from Northallerton, and because of heavy snow, I missed the train by 5 minutes. And that's obviously a pretty emotional thing. There were lots of footprints on the platform of people who obviously had got that train, and I guess they're in pretty bad state now. So
passengers who have managed to make the journey down from Yorkshire to London today, proving that there are some services between Yorkshire and London. GNER say that over the course of the next few days, it's unlikely that there'll be any services between York and London or Doncaster and York. Passengers are advised to take local services between Leeds and York, or bus services where applicable. Trains between Leeds and London will be running on a near normal service over the coming days. Reinstating passenger confidence, however, is a process that's likely to take weeks or months rather than days.
It's 6 o'clock, Wednesday the 28th of February.
The day that 13 people died and many more were injured, and yet more carnage on our railways.
This was the scene of utter devastation after the freak accident which happened this morning at Great Heck near Selby.
The wounded have been ferried to 6 hospitals across our region.
Experts say there's little rail staff could have done to avoid the disaster. Rescuers have spent all day combing the wreckage looking for survivors. Well, the first reporter on the scene this morning was Calendar's John Hill, and he's been there all day monitoring the rescue operation. Let's now cross to him again at the scene. John, what's the very latest?
Krista, the latest we've heard, to be honest, is an update on the casualty figures. Within the last half hour, we've had a news briefing from the head of the British Transport Police, Superintendent Tony Thompson. He says now that they know that 13 people have died. 11 bodies, though, that they understand remain on the wreckage of the train, of the express passenger train. 40 what they call walking wounded were taken to hospitals and in the area, and a further 30 people with serious injuries, head, chest and fractures to their limbs, were taken in ambulances on stretchers to 6 hospitals across the region. They fear that there is the possibility that there may be further bodies on the carriage, on the carriages of the express passenger train, but at this stage they just don't know. That, though, is their fear. Let's get the latest now, though, from David Wynne, who's the Deputy Chief Fire Officer for North Yorkshire. Mr. Wynne, it's been a massive operation for you. What's the focus now?
The focus now is trying to get some lighting established. We're still into assisting the police with body recovery. We'll be here for some considerable time, probably for the next 24 hours. And it's a painstaking but very sensitive task of trying to recover everybody.
And sadly, as we say, we now think there are no more survivors yet to be located.
I'm reasonably confident.
Tell me about the difficulties of the operation. In the
400 tonnes of Intercity Express derailed, then smashed, as it hurtled through North Yorkshire at 125 miles an hour. An accident of extraordinary coincidence. A 36-year-old man was towing a car on a trailer when it slid off the M62 motorway, down onto the main East Coast line. The car driver escaped serious injury, and while calling the police, saw the express coming. The Intercity driver, who died, would have had only seconds before the impact. All 11 carriages came off the track, juddering and careering, only to be ripped into by a freight train coming the other way.
It seemed as though there was something underneath the carriage, dragging on underneath the carriage, and then all the glass in the windows shattered and the glass was flying about, and something must have hit the carriage on the side, because on the right hand side going south the seats were torn out and into the aisle.
Both trains were partially under a bridge. It was dark, just after 6 a.m, and local residents were soon there.
There's a lot of diesel about. One of the things that surprised me was there's even diesel up on the top of the bridge here. It was absolutely soaked in diesel when I came across. The whole scene's just an absolute carnage. I personally cannot believe how a train can disintegrate into so many pieces. It is absolutely incredible.
Many of the passengers managed to get themselves out, but at least 30 had to be cut free, though it took 7 hours amid a jumble of wreckage and tons of coal from the freight train.
There was quite a number of people just dazed walking around. They got themselves off the train and they're walking around in a fairly dazed state. We managed to gather them all together and put them into a holding area, which was one of the farmers' sheds here. We then set the sides of the track up and down about 200 metres in front and behind the train to make sure nobody had wandered away and fell into ditches and things. So that was the scene when we first arrived. It was absolute chaos.
RAF helicopters took the most seriously injured to Hull and Leeds, and ambulances headed for these and 3 other hospitals. Throughout, there was no panic, just immense shock and confusion amid a major rescue operation.
The scene was a whole mixture of emotion, great shock, but also a calmness and a purpose of working. I can't pay enough tribute to the team of emergency service people who have helped the injured and done it with such great care and compassion and concern and marvellous efficiency.
The Queen sent a message of sympathy, and the Deputy Prime Minister, John Prescott, was on the scene by lunchtime as the rescue effort came to the point where there were no further survivors to be found amid the sprawl of wreckage spilling over into the muddy fields in the freezing cold. An accident which it seems could not have been foreseen. 2 vehicles tumbling from above in the dark onto a railway line between 2 oncoming trains. Kate Adey, BBC News, North Yorkshire.
As Kate was saying, the injured passengers were taken to a number of hospitals throughout Yorkshire, where doctors reported some critical injuries and provided urgent surgery. Around 30 of the wounded were taken to Pontefract, from where Catherine Marston sent us this report.
Throughout the morning, and at times working in terrible weather, a fleet of helicopters and ambulances transported the injured to hospitals across Yorkshire. Some were luckier than others, and after treatment could go home.
To be honest, I can't remember a huge amount. I just remember there was that sound like there was some like sort of throwing stones over the train, and then you could feel it go off the rails, and then To be honest, I can't remember anything after that until I was standing on the track.
Relatives of the victims say the injured are deeply upset by the crash.
She's seen a lot of people injured today, and she's had another scare. I think that's the reality of it. She could just as easily be dead now, or badly injured.
Many of the victims were far more badly hurt. More than 30 were taken to Pontefract Hospital, just a few miles from the scene of the crash. The victims had a variety of injuries, some of them very serious. At least 2 needed surgery.
I think every patient we had here was able to indicate to some degree how they were feeling. Most were obviously very shaken and very upset, as perhaps you can imagine.
Some patients clearly required specialist treatment for head and spinal injuries, and they were transferred to other hospitals. Many, though, are still too ill to be allowed home and will need medical treatment for some days to come.
Well, tonight, of the 31 victims that were brought to Pontefract Infirmary, 16 are still here. 8 of those have what's described as very serious life-threatening injuries, although we understand they have all now been stabilised. One person is in intensive care and another will be transferred to a hospital in Leeds later on this evening. The poorliest people have injuries like to their spines, to their heads, and also internal injuries, and they will be here for at least the next few days. Hugh.
Catherine, thanks very much. The inquiry is already underway. Among several difficult questions, how was it possible for a car to roll down an embankment onto the railway tracks? Here's our transport correspondent, Simon Montague.
This is where the Land Rover and its trailer carrying an empty car went off the road, and this is where they ended up. On the verge of the motorway, you can see the tyre marks in the grass. And as you travel along the carriageway, you realise the Land Rover was already halfway down the embankment before the start of the crash barrier that was supposed to protect the railway line. While the emergency services have been tackling the disaster that followed, investigators have been seeking the initial cause. Where the motorway crosses over the railway, the tracks are protected by a 30-metre crash barrier. The Land Rover and its trailer were heading west on the M62. The vehicles went out of control and left the motorway before the crash barrier started. They slid down onto the track. The driver of the vehicle called for help at 0612. He was still on the phone 3 minutes later when he heard the Newcastle to London GNER express train approaching. It hit the car. The passenger train was derailed, but it travelled upright for a short while before rolling onto the other track. It was then struck by the coal train heading in the opposite direction. For GNER, it's the second major disaster in 5 months. One of the locomotives in today's crash was involved at Hatfield as well. And once again, the accident was not the company's fault.
And how it is possible for a vehicle to come off a motorway and come onto the road line, it's got to be investigated. It should not happen. Our job is to make the railways safe, and after Hatfield we have worked so hard to make the railways safe, and we continue to work to make the railways safe. And then for something like this to happen, that's got to be looked at and investigated.
The crash barrier leading up to the motorway bridge meets the required design standard from 1985. The Highways Agency that's responsible for the motorway has sent engineers to the scene. They've joined the police plus investigators from the Transport Research Laboratory and Health and Safety Executive. It's a joint effort to find out how what started as an ordinary traffic accident turned into a major disaster. Simon Montague, BBC News.
Let's go back to Selby and join Kate Adey. Kate, the emergency services, as we saw in your report, working very hard throughout the day at the crash site. What is the position there now?
Well, as night has fallen, those people whom you saw inspecting the track, and there's been huge numbers of people covering the large area which this crash has covered, from where the initial impact was to where the trains eventually ended up, they have stopped work. But we got indication a short while ago that they may be removing some of the bodies that have been left in the wreckage during the day. Arc lights have now been set up, and it looks as if more work is going to go on.
Just 6 months, difficult to believe, Kate, really, since the Hatfield tragedy, and yet the circumstances here very, very different. Some would say bizarre circumstances.
I think this is one of those occasions where the word accident does cover it. An accident in which several things combined, which you would not plan for, which you would not imagine could all happen. But these things do happen. that it has happened at a time when railways have been much on people's minds. I think this is added to everything. But tonight it is seen as a terrible accident.
Kate, Ms Selby, thank you for that. And there is an emergency phone number for anyone who's worried about relatives who may have been involved, and the phone number is 020 7834 7777. Once again, 020 7834 7777. And viewers in the north and northeast of England can see a special programme on the crash. That's after the 10 o'clock news tonight. And BBC News 24 will bring you any further developments throughout the evening. Today's other stories now. The foot and mouth crisis is getting worse. At least 6 more cases were confirmed today. There are growing fears that strict measures to control the disease have failed to stop it spreading abroad. Today's new cases are spread across England and Wales, 2 in mid-Wales, 1 in Herefordshire, 1 in Lancashire, 1 in Devon, and 1 in...
Horrendous, and there's a lot of tangled wreckage. It's going to take us some time to actually work our way through, both to recover those people that we know are dead in the wreckage, and also to see if there's anybody else in there. But it's far too early. Our priority, obviously, is to get those people out and to identify them, so that those people who are sadly waiting anxiously for some news can actually be told whether they've lost someone or not. But it's going to be a long and difficult job.
Now, the emergency services and yourself have been working there all day, but you're still there. What's going on now?
Well, the recovery process is continuing. The lighting and generators are being put up, and the plans have been worked out to sectorise the different sections. We know where we've identified people that are already dead in the wreckage. Those people have got to be removed. It's a very slow process. Once we have removed all the dead people, then we will be recovering the property. I mean, there'll be thousands of items of property to recover. And also the investigation is carrying on. As you're aware, that the cause appears to be the Land Rover going off the M62, landing on the railway tracks when it was hit by the 445 Great North Eastern high-speed train from Newcastle to London, which then deflected off the wreckage and then hit the oncoming freight train. But it's one hell of a mess there at the scene. It's going to take us some time to clear it, and people sadly will have to be patient because everybody's doing as best they can, but that's our top priority.
Have you any idea how long before this wreckage, this carnage is all gone from here?
Well, if you look back to Hatfield and to Ladbroke Grove, it was at least 2 weeks before the scene was clear, so I think people are going to be prepared for a long wait. But to say our prime consideration is for all those people who are waiting anxiously for news, and we're all doing our very best to get the people out so we can get them identified. But this is a long and difficult process, but that is our top task.
Just finally, the Hatfield disaster knocked the railway industry for 6. What were your feelings when you saw this?
Well, absolutely devastated. Unfortunately, I've been to far too many of these, dating back to Clapham in 1988, and I didn't think I'd see another one after Clapham. Unfortunately, I've been to far too many, but yes, I mean, we sort of go into mode which is wanted to deal with, but sadly you can never train for something like this. It's just gets pretty overwhelming, but we've got a job to do and we have to do it to the best of our ability.
Thank you, Superintendent Thompson. Thank you very much for bringing us up to date. And with that, it's back to you again in the studio.
Yes, thanks, Katie. Well, joining us now again is Charles Watkinson, one of the residents of Great Heck, and indeed the first outsider, as it were, onto the train crash scene itself. Charles, you spoke very movingly earlier on about your impressions of the crash, and one of the things that keeps coming up is the awesome power of the crash itself. It does beg a belief, doesn't it?
It does. The actual pictures of the train itself that we're seeing here on the television don't give any real idea of what it is like when you are close up. I wasn't the first on the scene, but I was probably the first into some of the more badly damaged, inaccessible carriages. I ran with a neighbour to get a ladder and got into a couple of the carriages initially and spoke with people, told them that rescue was on the way. I was very surprised at the stoicism of the people in the carriages. There were people uninjured or apparently uninjured who were helping people who were injured, and they were all very calm and collected, and even the injured were not complaining. They weren't saying, "Get me out of here," or anything like that.
They were just patiently waiting to be rescued.
It does seem trite to say this, but you were a man learning lessons as you stood at this impossibly desolate scene.
Yes, I was just very frustrated at not being able to help more than I could help. We did manage to get about 12 people off the train, myself and another guy who was a member of a mountain rescue team who had a window breaking hammer, and we managed to break a few windows and get people out by that means.
You see, we journalists over the coming weeks might ask questions, might ask difficult questions, but as you stood there, could you understand the initial helplessness, the quiet, the silence that surrounds an immense tragedy?
I couldn't understand how it was possible for the scene to be just so calm and so quiet. It was actually eerie.
Well, thanks very much for coming in. As Krista said earlier on the programme, we appreciate that, and well, you probably don't know it yourself. You're in shock, and I know you're very moved, just like the Chief Executive of GNER himself. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you. My heart goes out to the people on the train.
Thank you, Charles Watkins.
Let's now go back to Pontefract to find out the very latest on the casualties from our reporter Chris Kiddy. Chris, what's happening?
Yes, it's been an extremely busy day for staff here at Pontefract General Infirmary. 31 casualties were brought here this morning after this morning's train crash, and 15 remain here tonight. 2 are in intensive care. One, we are told, has internal injuries, another has severe chest injuries. Now, throughout the day, casualties have been transferred from here to other hospitals in the region. 3 went to Jimmy's with spinal and pelvic injuries. They went under police escort this afternoon. 1 person has gone to the LGI in Leeds with severe chest injuries, and another casualty was transferred from here to Pinderfield Hospital in Wakefield with severe facial fractures. So the news from Pontefract tonight is that 2 people are still seriously ill here in intensive care, 12 hours after this morning's tragic train crash. From Pontefract, it's back to you in the studio.
Thanks very much, Chris. Well, earlier today, Krista spoke to a rail expert, indeed, a member of Rail magazine, Christian Woolmer.
In London is a rail expert, Christian Woolmer from Rail magazine. Christian, from what we know about this morning's tragedy, it would seem to be more a freak accident than another Hatfield or Paddington, wouldn't it?
Yes, this is really a road accident that has caused a rail disaster rather than a rail safety matter. And I think that's what the focus of the investigation will be on. It's not like Hatfield or Ladbroke Grove and Southall, all of which had reasons caused by rail industry people. This is a result of a very unlucky piece of possibly bad or unlucky driving by somebody that then caused a rail disaster.
Nevertheless, one question still remains for me unanswered tonight, and that is how, if there was an accident on the track, how another train 7 minutes down the line would fail to know of it?
We don't know what the time between the 2 trains was. What we don't know precisely that timing. Now, of course, if the line had been fouled and the train was lying there for some distance, for some time, there is a procedure by which rail staff run up the line to put down detonators and to warn the oncoming train. Now, it's very clear, as I understand it, that there wasn't that amount of time. There wasn't a big gap between the 2 trains arriving, and there wasn't time to alert the second train.
Nevertheless, Christian Woolmer, I mean, one can certainly say tonight that public confidence at rail travel has been dented even further by this disaster.
Well, of course, people will be anxious about this, but I think it is very important to stress that statistically rail does remain the safest form of travel. The trouble is, when you have an accident like this, it does create very dramatic pictures. It creates a lot of interest in the media, and it gets a lot of coverage. But for example, only a couple of days after the Hatfield disaster, there were 6 people killed, I think in your area, on the motorway accident, and there was virtually no coverage at all. And I think that's one of the issues. But people should not be put off travelling on the railways. It is still, on average, much safer than travelling on the roads.
Well, we make no apologies for the amount of coverage today. It has been a terrible, terrible day. But Christian Wommer, thank you very much for your words. Yes, we must actually make it quite clear that I spoke to Christian, in fact, half an hour ago. And as we know already from speaking to the Chief Executive live on this programme, Christopher Gard at GNR, in fact, the time gap between the crash of the two trains was much, much shorter than that. In fact, Mike, it was only, I think, a question of seconds. And that, to me, is the most incredible thing.
Absolutely. Well, let's end by going back for the final time to Great Heck to get the latest there from our two reporters who've been at the scene all day long, John Hill and Katie Oscroft. And Katie, let's ask quite simply your impressions of the day and what sticks in your mind.
Well, it's been a terribly tragic day. I think on the way here, there was no indication that the scene was going to look quite as bad as it did. You just see now that they're actually moving some heavy lifting gear in to help with the clear-up operation tonight. But yes, we had no idea that it was going to look quite so horrific, and I think our thoughts were, how did anyone get out of this alive? We spoke to some of the people who did get out of it alive, and I think they too were thinking that themselves. As they came out of this in the darkness, they weren't really aware what was happening. They could feel it and see it and smell the fumes, but when they saw the wreckage in the cold light of day, they were absolutely horrified.
John, you were the first on the scene, and I know that you would want to pay tribute to the bravery of all the emergency services. They've worked so hard today, haven't they?
I think they would say that they weren't overwhelmed, but I think when they turn in tonight, they're really going to consider what an extraordinary and tragic turn of events today has been, because they've worked like superhumans, really. When I arrived shortly before 8 o'clock, there were hundreds of fire personnel and ambulance staff doing their very best, and I'm afraid that's all they could do today.
Well, John and Katie, many thanks, and indeed thanks to all our reporters, to our camera crews and technical staff.
All right, now though, we leave you with the words and images of what was a truly tragic day at Great Heck.
Good night. At least 13 are dead, more than 60 have been injured.
It's a tragedy that happened when the 446 pulled out from Newcastle. Then there was a crash at Great Heck near Selby.
Ready to the scene of terrible devastation.
Tangled pieces of metal everywhere. A lot of people in pain.
There seemed to be something underneath the carriage, and then all the windows shattered.
Frantic rescue attempts began this morning.
The front of the vehicle actually fell foul of the railway line and was struck by the GNR train that was travelling south.
The sickening noise woke people living next to the line. Running to help, they couldn't believe the scale of the disaster.
Horrific, absolutely horrific.
The Chief Executive of GNR just said, I never thought I'd see anything like this again after Hatfield. I'm so desperately sorry for all the people and the staff involved.
YTV Weather, sponsored by Yorkshire Electricity.
Minister here, Breeze Rogers, has just given another news conference just a very short time ago.
Because what counts will be the performance and the way that he employs his tactics. So what the fans are really looking for tonight is hope for the future.
Kevin, thank you very much for that. Now in a few moments we'll be back at the scene of that terrible rail crash in Selby. We saw the emergency services there earlier on in the reports working in bitterly cold conditions. Helen, it's been that kind of day, isn't it?
It has indeed, yes. Winter is still very much with us at the moment, and the snow's been working its way down towards the south. Admittedly, it's nowhere near as severe as further north, what we saw in Scotland and Northern Ireland. But we're going to find more sunshine over the next few days breaking through. It will be very frosty by night, severe frost in actual fact. Very cold days still to come, and it now looks as though it's going to be into next week before we see the milder weather. So for this evening and tonight, this weather front is still giving some rain, sleet and wet snow down across southern and easternmost areas. As you can see, it pulls away towards the east overnight, and that will leave many areas under clear skies, although there will be snow showers still in the north and the east, and also coming into Northern Ireland. So in the north, just look at these temperatures, -10, -12 across the snowfields in Scotland, -5 to -7 in Northern Ireland. And even down to the south where it stays cloudier, temperatures will be close to freezing, and that means for many of us it will be icy on the roads. For tomorrow, we keep that weather front in the south and the east, so more cloud to come here with some wet snow, some sleet and some rain. We're probably just going to see a dusting of snow over the higher ground. Further west and north it will be a drier and sunnier day with snow showers in the north, but perhaps in the afternoon we will see more of those coming down the western coast as well and across into Northern Ireland. The top temperatures tomorrow, if we can call them that, around 3 to 5 degrees, so still feeling very cold, around 0 to -2 over the snowfields. Into Friday we're going to continue with snow showers down the east coast and some in the west as well, but for many dry and fine. There'll be more weather in the next half hour.
Excellent, thank you very much. Main story today, of course, the rail crash in North Yorkshire which claimed the lives of 13 people and injured 70. A high-speed passenger express crashed head-on with a freight train on the East Coast main line at Great Heck near Selby. It happened after a Land Rover and trailer crashed off the nearby M62 and slid onto the tracks. Emergency workers have spent much of the day freeing passengers from the wreckage and treating survivors. Back to our chief news correspondent, Kate Adie, who's at the scene. Kate, amid all the gloom today, one encouraging remark, at least from the Prime Minister, when he praised the noble conduct, as he put it, of local people rushing to help people at the scene there.
Indeed, some of the wreckage ended up in a front garden just below me here, and those people were woken by what had happened. And when they went out, everybody has said that it was calm, even though there was chaos. Nobody could quite work out the situation. And local people helped, and a lot of people from the train were taken into a nearby barn, which was the closest and warmest place to go, and looked after.
Kate Adie at Selby, thank you very much for that. Time is nearly 6:30. We'll be back with the latest just before 7. But that's it from us for now, on the day Britain confronted yet another tragic accident on the rail network. From all of us on the 6 o'clock news team, a good evening to you.
Did you know how easy it is to watch almost all your favourite BBC programmes with subtitles? From award-winning drama and comedy to films, sports coverage and the local and national news. You can find subtitles for all sorts of programmes on CFAX page 888. Or if you're a digital viewer, simply select subtitles from the menu. Log on to bbc.co.uk/info for more details.
Across Yorkshire, Lincolnshire and the North Midlands, this is BBC One with Look North, presented by Claire Frisbee in Leeds and Harry Gratian at the scene of the Selby train crash.
Good evening from Great Heck near Selby, the scene of one of the worst train crashes ever in the north of England, and certainly one of the biggest ever rescue operations. Normally this village is almost anonymous, but today it finds itself centre stage after a freak accident. A sea of total carnage, the high-speed passenger train shredded as it collides with a coal train. The car that triggered the fatal chain reaction. How did the Land Rover and trailer come off the road and crash onto the line below?
You could feel it off the rails, and then, to be honest, I can't remember anything after that until I was standing on the track.
A rumble followed by a thunderous jolt were the only audible warnings that the villagers of Great Heck received this morning at around 6:20. After that, there was almost total chaos as the rescue operation moved into place. We'll be looking at the day's events through the eyes of our reporters in the next 20 minutes or so. But first, let me tell you where Great Heck is. It's a very small village, 7 miles or so from Selby, and about the same distance from Pontefract as well. Our first report comes from Vicky Johnson.
This is the scene of utter carnage which has catapulted the tiny village of Great Heck into the public consciousness like Hatfield and Paddington before it. 20 minutes after leaving York, passengers were jolted out of their early morning reveries by a hideous grinding. They all knew immediately what was to come.
All of a sudden the lights went out and we just seemed to be going everywhere in all directions. It came to a stop and the coach filled up with diesel fumes, you know, fumes up. And I went and tried to open the emergency door, broke the glass and, you know, got out.
This disastrous mangling of the two trains appears to be the result of a freak combination of circumstances. A Land Rover towing a trailer with a car on top careered off the M62 motorway down the embankment onto the main line below. Moments later, the GNER service travelling at 120 miles an hour collided with it. Although the GNER train stayed upright, it then veered into the path of a freight train heading north to the nearby power stations. Villagers, who were woken up by the sickening scraping of iron and steel, rushed to help.
With my neighbour here, we went and got some ladders and tried to assist people getting off the train. The whole thing's just an absolute carnage. I personally cannot believe how a train can disintegrate into so many pieces. It is absolutely incredible.
While ambulances ferried up to 70 passengers to local hospitals, firemen worked for hours to cut through the wreckage to recover more of the dead and injured. Meanwhile, the walking wounded were comforted by the local clergy.
It was a question of holding people's hand in some cases, being asked to pray with them, just listening to them, and many people wanting to get word to relatives that they were okay in the sense of being out of the carriages.
People living close by had a miraculous escape, with the overturned freight train spewing coal and mangled wreckage literally up to their doorsteps.
I think I'm incredibly lucky, and I think the person next door family are. You know, it could have been a lot worse. I mean, if you know, some of these large bogies off these trucks had taken off into the air, they could have gone straight through into the house, couldn't they?
There have been literally scores of reporters, camera crews and photographers here, but now we've been moved away from the bridge while heavy lifting gear is brought in. We understand that all the bodies have been removed from the train and now the salvage operation can begin in earnest. But that operation could take days and the inquiry even longer, leaving those involved in today's disaster with time to reflect on the few seconds it took to turn their lives upside down. Vicky Johnson, BBC Look North, Great Heck.
Well, some of the first people onto the scene, Dean Fuddipat, who lives probably about 50 yards or so. Just tell us exactly what you saw, Dean.
Well, I saw initially, I was woken up by my wife, who saw three ambulances and fire engines outside our door, and we thought initially it was actually our house which might have a problem, and then we rushed out, and I got dressed and I walked up the road and began to see the sort of start of what was obviously an absolutely horrific accident. I looked to the left and I could see a train engine on its top about 5 yards away from somebody's house, a neighbour's house. And then as I walked further up the bridge, I looked to the right and saw some more carriages and over the bridge, and then I saw the full scale of what's occurred today.
Now, the Reverend Cyril Roberts, you were here probably within about half an hour or so from Great Snake. What exactly did you see?
Well, by that time, quite a few people had walked out of the accident and were milling around in the farmyard, looking very shocked and very lost and very frightened. Some of the local people had already got tea organised and opened up the offices, and the emergency services were here by then and arrived in huge numbers shortly afterwards, and it was actually quite surprisingly orderly and not a hint of chaos really, which is what I would have expected.
Just a quick word, was your job really just to try and calm people down? Had they needed that?
No, it was all pretty calm. I spent quite a lot of time talking with people and listening to them and hugging them and holding their hand, just trying to be supportive really, and then I moved into the barn which was a sort of temporary triage post where more seriously injured people were. Some of them looked very seriously injured to me.
Just a quick word, Dean, how do you think the community's been affected? A brief answer if I may.
Well, I think we're very, very saddened by what's happened and shocked, and I think you know, we mourn the loss of a lot of people today.
Dean and Cyril, thank you very much indeed for joining us this evening. Well, the Prime Minister himself has paid tribute to those who died and the community affected. And responding to a question from the Selby MP, John Grogan, he said that a full and detailed investigation would take place.
In respect of the villagers in my honourable friend's constituency, they have behaved in an extraordinary, neighbourly, exemplary way. And it is remarkable how, in Britain, local communities, in times of crisis like this, pull together and do the very best for other people.
The Prime Minister, Tony Blair. Well, within minutes of the crash actually happening, the emergency services were on the scene. Some of the injured and walking were treated at the trackside. Many others were driven or flown to hospitals in or around the region. Paul Murphy reports on what was a massive medical effort.
At 28 minutes past 7 this morning, less than an hour after it happened, the first casualties were arriving at Pontefract General Infirmary.
I was just reading my paper and then suddenly there was all this noise and the train started making funny movements. You just felt like you're hitting a branch or something to start with, and it just got worse. So that was it. Can't remember anything else.
Hospitals in Doncaster, Leeds, York and Hull also began emergency measures, but Pontefract, just 15 miles from the crash, took most of the casualties.
We received 31 patients. Other hospitals in the region also took patients, and you know, from our point of view, things went, I think, as well as they could have done.
Then there are the scars the medics alone can't treat, the traumatised victims and families in need of emotional support.
Well, Christian love, compassion, and just to be there for them. It's everybody's worst nightmare, isn't it?
Among many distraught relatives, Di Edwards, who'd rescued his own daughter from the crash after she'd phoned him from her mobile.
And obviously when you wake up and you get a message like that, it's quite a shock. And she couldn't tell me where she was, but she thought they weren't as far as Doncaster from York. Siding Selby Police.
Bill Shaw visits his injured wife in Hull. As a victim of the Lockington train disaster 15 years ago, he'd often talked to her about how to survive a train crash.
And do you believe your wife was aware of this safety advice?
Because she said to me, I did exactly what you said. I mean, that was one of the second things she said. I'm okay, I did what you said, I got down on the floor.
Tonight, more than 40 victims of this crash are being treated at hospitals throughout the region. Their distraught relatives are continuing to arrive, and they're being met by trained counsellors. My colleague Phil Connell is at the Pontefract General Infirmary.
Yes, well, the hospital's emergency procedure was launched with full effect this morning. Since then, staff here have treated the majority of people injured in this morning's crash, 31 in all, and tonight the conditions of several of those people is still giving cause for serious concern. Well, Mike Playforth, you've had a busy day working in casualty. What sort of injuries have you been dealing with?
Well, of those 31 patients you mentioned, 8 have had potentially very serious injuries. One patient had to have an immediate operation for internal injuries, and that operation has been successful, and is now on our intensive care unit, is now stable.
And how have people been coping with really what they've been through?
I think it's a very difficult time for all the people who've been involved in this tragedy. They seem to have been stunned, really. The cold, I think, has had a dramatic effect. The vicinity is out in the wilds as far as they were concerned, so life's been very difficult and very hard for them today.
Obviously you rehearse for major incidents like this, don't you, Mike? But how's it gone for you today?
As I think we would have liked it to have gone very professional. Everybody has performed their roles to a very, very high standard. All the people that we wanted to come in answered the call. Many people who were actually on holiday came in to help us. So the staff from all branches within the hospital have worked magnificently.
Okay, well, we've just heard that Yvette Cooper, the local MP and the Minister for Health, is due at the hospital in the next half an hour or so, where it's expected she'll meet some of those people who have been injured. For the moment, though, it's back to you, Harry, at the scene of the crash.
Bill, thank you very much indeed. It appears that a number of events contributed to this crash, and in the end, it appears to have just been bad luck. It was just after 6 o'clock this morning when police received a call from a man who said his car and trailer had careered down an embankment on the westbound carriageway of the M62 where it crossed the East Coast main line. As he made the call, he told the operator a train was coming. The train hit the car and derailed and came to rest across both railway lines. Moments later, a coal train travelling northwards ploughed into the derailed GNER train with the devastating consequences. Well, now let's go to London, where we have Richard Hope from the Railway Gazette. Richard, I hope you can hear me okay. This basically just seems to be total bad luck, this crash.
Well, it certainly was. Extremely bad luck that just happened to be this GNER passenger train coming along a few seconds after the car got onto the railway. And then, of course, the fact that it met a freight train a little bit further down the line. My information is that the freight train and the passenger train were still moving when they collided with each other at substantial speed, and that's why we've seen this very, very severe wreckage.
Now this was a very significant part of the track, wasn't it? This is a high-speed part of the track.
Yes, the maximum speed here is 125 miles an hour for passenger trains, of course. The freight train in question would be authorised to run at 75 miles an hour, but perhaps might have been going a little slower, 60 to 65 miles an hour. We'll have to wait and be told about that.
Now this comes at a very, very bad time, of course, with British Rail just getting back to normal in some shape or form.
Yes, we've had a very rough time on the railway since the Hatfield crash, derailment on this same line, and one of the same great northeastern trains involved. That occurred in October, just over 4 months ago, and with massive speed restrictions, particularly on the East Coast main line, because of the condition of the rails. The services have been in a shambles, but now, as you say, they are getting back to some sort of normality, or at least they were, as far as the East Coast is concerned.
Richard Hope of the Railway Gazette, thank you very much indeed for joining us. We've been joined now by Superintendent Tony Thompson from British Transport Police. Good evening. Can you tell us what the latest developments are?
Well, we still have 13 people confirmed dead, of which 11 are still in the wreckage. The situation down below us and behind us that you can't see is extremely complicated. There's an awful lot of mangled wreckage. It is quite horrendous and very, very difficult to work. What we've got to do is gradually remove, starting from the outside, working in, to remove all the wreckage, remove the carriages, and that's going to take some time.
And of course there's a great sensitivity about this particular process, a very distressing one as well.
It is indeed, but our priority is to recover those that have died in this tragic disaster as soon as we can, so that those people who are waiting anxiously now for some news can be told whether their loved ones have died or survived. And that's going to take some time. It's not going to be a quick process.
I take it that this scene now that we're witnessing behind us with heavy lifting gear, etc. coming in, will be something that the residents around here will have to be used to for quite some time to come now.
To be realistic, if we look back to Hatfield and Ladbroke Grove, the scene was in operation for about 2 weeks, so I think we're going to see a lot of this activity for the next couple of weeks.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Tony Thompson, for joining us. I know it's going to be a long and arduous process in this respect. Now, of course, many people will be very concerned that they've got relatives who have been involved in this crash. Can I give you a helpline number specifically for those who feel they're involved in some shape or form? The number is 0207 834 777. That's 0207 834 777. But now we can go over to York Railway Station, where Penny Bustin is talking to someone from GNER. Penny.
Thank you, Harry. Yes, I have with me the Chief Executive of GNER, Christopher Garnett. You must think of today as a completely freak sort of day.
Couldn't believe it when I heard about this accident and the extraordinary sequence of events that led to it happening. This car coming off the motorway, missing the safety barrier by about 5–10 metres, we think, coming across the field onto the track, hitting the track within 15 seconds or so, our train hitting it, and within about another 15 seconds the freight train coming the other way, hitting our train. So these a number of events all coming together in this totally freak accident were just terrible.
And it's a road traffic accident, isn't it?
I really don't think it was an accident that any train company could have prevented happening. This was a car coming off a motorway which should never have been allowed to come off the motorway and got onto the trains.
So what can be done to prevent this ever happening again?
Well, I assume that the Highways Agency or whoever will have the same sort of rigorous review after an accident like this that we have after Hatfield and after other accidents, to say what are the learning points. And clearly they've got to say, you know, are the safety barrier rules on motorways and on A roads, are they correct? That needs reviewing, obviously.
There was one in how many billion chance of this actually happening?
Well, somebody's done an analysis, so something like 67 billion chance of this accident happening. It is a freak accident. It is not caused by our trains or by the railway, and it's terrible for all the families and everybody else involved.
We must offer our condolences to you, because I understand you've lost a couple of members of staff today as well.
We understand that some of our staff, we're waiting to hear the full information, but it is absolutely terrible.
Mr. Garnett, thank you for joining us on this day. With that, back to Harry at the scene.
Penny, thank you very much indeed. I'm not sure whether you can see the activity going on behind me, but some heavy lifting gear is now in place, and that will be the scene here for the next few days. More from me later. For the time being, back to the studio and Claire.
Harry, thank you.
Now the day's other main news, and a third farm in our region, this time in Lincolnshire, is being investigated in connection with the outbreak of foot and mouth. The farm at Pinchbeck in Lincolnshire has been cordoned off. East Coast Main Line. Emergency services are still at the scene. For the latest, let's go back now over to Harry.
Well, back here at the scene, Claire, it has to be said there's a very unnatural feel about the whole place, and most of us feel very uneasy about the knowledge that some of the bodies are still actually in the carriages. Obviously, disruption is very, very severe, will be for the next few days, probably the next few weeks. We can get the latest on that situation by rejoining Penny Bustin at York Railway Station.
Good evening. Good evening from a rather sombre York Railway Station, where they've been trying to come to terms today with the thought that some of the passengers who alighted from this particular platform onto the 5:59 service to London this morning will not be coming home this evening. Most of those on the train got on Northallerton or here at York. There were at least 30 booked places from here. In the station car park, plenty of reminders of the popularity of this particular early morning service to London. Parking tickets bought in the critical half hour before the departure time. It is of course possible that some of these cars will not be collected from here this evening. Some of the information staff who were on days off here today came in voluntarily when they realised the significance of what had gone on to help with passengers who were seeking information about their journeys. We found mixed views, some people shaken by today's events, but others convinced that rail travel was still a safe form.
Yeah, I'm a bit worried, anyone would be, I think.
I mean, actually, that accident was a complete fluke. I mean, you're much more likely to get killed on the roads. I mean, there's probably that number of people killed on the roads during the day, but it just doesn't hit the headlines. So.
The accident this morning wasn't out to do with trains, I think it was out cars.
So if you are thinking of travelling from York, there are obviously no services between here and Doncaster. The advice is to go from York to Leeds, and that's by Northern Spirit, and there are then hourly services from Leeds to King's Cross. So no services directly from here. Go to Leeds, where there are hourly services to King's Cross. Go from York to Leeds on Northern Spirit services. Obviously disruption will last for the foreseeable future. From York Railway Station, handing back to Harry.
Penny, thanks very much indeed. We have a special programme tonight looking at the whole of the day's events. That takes place just after 10:25. You can see how surgeons at the Hull Royal Infirmary and the RAF launched their own fight for life as they battle to save those injured in the crash. You know, it's rather difficult at some stages to describe initial feelings when you see something like this. It also makes you realise how lucky we are to have rescue services of the calibre of the people we've seen in action today. The quick response in the most trying of circumstances was nothing far short of remarkable. We leave you tonight with the pictures we'll never forget. 13 people have died, others are fighting for their lives, and all because they took the wrong train at the wrong time. From all of us, good night.
Good evening. Well, yesterday it looked as though the winter cold snap would end.
70 people injured, the fatalities far worse than Hatfield, but the cause nothing whatever to do with Railtrack or the rail companies. Good evening. It started as an ordinary traffic accident, a tyre blowout, and ended with nearly 2,000 tonnes of mangled Railtrack trucks and carriages. Tonight, a bizarre rail disaster in which tragic coincidence renders the phrase total accident entirely justified. We report how a Land Rover and its trailer veered off a bridge approach onto the East Coast Main Line, yards short of the crash barrier designed to safeguard it. And we hear the harrowing consequences.
And then all the windows shattered.
It was frightening at the time.
We took some ladders and broke a few windows, and with assistance of other passengers started helping people off the train.
Also tonight, 8 new outbreaks of foot and mouth disease, at least one so far unlinked to any other, and the first in Northern Ireland. And from Germany, how officials there found British sheep carrying foot and mouth but not suffering from it.
And the other headlines tonight, the Snakehead connection. A court hears how the traffic in illegal immigrants led to the deaths of 58 people in an airtight lorry. Under investigation, the Belgrade prosecutor orders the police to act against Milosevic. And game on. Eriksson reveals his hand as England prepare to take the field against Spain.
The scenes of carnage, the testimony of survivors, the search through the wreckage, so much of today's train crash near Selby was sadly familiar. But the cause of the accident, which left 13 people dead and 70 more injured, was truly exceptional. Not a broken rail, nor signalling failures. Today's tragedy appears to be the result of something as banal as a burst tyre. The crash happened in North Yorkshire, south of Selby, near the village of Great Heck. It was just after 6 in the morning when a Land Rover travelling westbound on the M62 suffered what's thought to have been a tyre blowout. It was pulling a trailer which had a blue Renault on it. The two vehicles and the low loader slid off the motorway and rolled onto the East Coast mainline track. At the same time, the 4:45 a.m. Newcastle to London GNER service, travelling at 125 miles an hour, approached the vehicles. At 6:12 a.m. the train smashed into the cars. The impact derailed the passenger train, but it managed to stay upright for a few hundred metres. Travelling at around 60 miles an hour in the opposite direction was a 1,600-ton Freightliner goods train. The two trains collided. The impact left all 9 carriages of the passenger train derailed and 1 flattened. Well, now Sarah Smith has spent the day in North Yorkshire and joins us now from the crash site. Sarah.
John, the emergency services are still working here tonight, trying to recover the dead from the horribly mangled wreckage. They've removed 2 bodies so far. They know there are another 11 still trapped inside. They can't rule out that there might be still more trapped in the wreckage. And at the same time, investigators are trying to establish how this tragedy occurred. As you said, not a rail accident this time, well, not the fault of the railways, but a road accident which became a rail accident with such terrible consequences. The big unanswered question is how the Land Rover was able to come off the road and end up on the railway line. The bridge over the tracks, the safety barriers on either side of it appear to be undamaged. Justin Rolat now reports on the events of the day here in Great Heck.
In other recent crashes, there is no suggestion that an equipment failure caused this tragedy. No problems with signalling, trains or tracks. This appalling accident appears to have been just that, an accident. This Land Rover attached to a trailer carrying a car appears somehow to have slipped from the motorway bridge down onto the railway below. The driver is understood to have scrambled from his car, but as he desperately telephoned the emergency services, the 4:45 express train from Newcastle came through. It is thought to have been travelling at full speed, 125 miles an hour. The train hit the Land Rover head on, and as it continued to hurtle down the track, the train began to derail. That's when a northbound freight train travelling at 80 miles an hour and laden with thousands of tons of coal came through.
The train hadn't been going very long, making steady progress, when all of a sudden it started to brake quite hard, which was the first indication there was anything wrong. The sensation then of grit on the track before the train jumped off the track and went down an embankment.
There were about 100 people on board the passenger train. Many were commuters bound for London, planning to catch the start of the working day. The damage was horrendous. Carriages were thrown across the tracks. One ended up in a field.
We were called to it at 6:30 this morning. The first crews on arrival were met with obviously a scene of devastation with casualties from the train wandering around in the field. They had to prioritise which carriages they were going to attend to first. So what we did, we actually tasked a firefighter from to go to each carriage and do an assessment of each carriage to see how many people were in there, whether they were injured severely or just walking wounded, or if people were trapped.
13 people died in the crash, 70 were injured, many seriously. It took almost 7 hours to cut free all the survivors. The local vicar was on the scene soon after the accident happened.
I've never seen anything like it. It was very, very distressing. People were very, very upset, very shaken, and from my point of view, the worst thing I've ever seen, I think. I've never seen anything remotely like this.
A makeshift hospital was set up to treat the wounded in a nearby field. A fleet of ambulances ferried people to local hospitals, and at around midday, John Prescott arrived to survey the damage.
It's horrific, and from a set of unbelievable circumstances.
But nevertheless, I hope that the inquiries that are being conducted at the moment and the investigations will give us more information as to what happened. But at the moment, of course, our thoughts must be with those who've been injured, and indeed the relatives of the dead, and again to express our appreciation to the emergency services that have come and done a wonderful job.
The big question is just how that Land Rover came to be on the tracks. Police say there is no damage either to the motorway bridge or to fencing. Channel 4 News understands the driver is still being questioned by police. Perhaps only he can say precisely how this appalling accident happened. Justin Rowlatt, Channel 4 News, just outside Selby.
Dealing with the huge numbers of seriously injured people in a tragedy like this is obviously an enormously difficult operation. First priority is the walking wounded, and a triage centre was set up in a nearby barn to try and treat them. Many of the most seriously injured had to be cut out of the wreckage and rushed to nearby hospitals, some of them in air ambulances. Pontefract Hospital took the largest number of the casualties, and there tonight 2 patients are still in intensive care, 6 more in a serious condition, and another 13 being kept in overnight on other wards. Earlier there today, I spoke to Mike Playforth, who described some of the injuries he'd had to deal with.
The injuries have either involved the head, chest or abdomen. The cuts to the head have been really quite extensive, which I think is an indication of the seriousness of the force that's been involved in this accident. And again, the injuries to the chest have not been just simple cracked ribs. They've involved damage to the structures of the lung and heart as well. So that is why the patients are on the intensive care unit, and why we had to transfer one of the patients to the cardiothoracic unit at Leeds General Infirmary.
And can you describe to me the mood of the patients when they came in?
They're incredibly quiet. I've never seen them like it. There was no moaning or crying. They were just obviously stunned, unbelieving what they'd been involved in, I think. They were calm, I suppose, and they're very appreciative of the treatment they had.
Well, here on a bridge in Great Heck overlooking the wreckage, I'm joined by Superintendent Tony Thompson of British Transport Police. Superintendent, what can you tell us you've been able to establish so far about how this accident occurred?
Well, we know, and you can't probably see behind us, that the M62 motorway runs from the east to the west, and a Land Rover that was going from the east heading west somehow left the road just before reaching the bridge over the railway line, drove down onto the railway track, where shortly afterwards it was hit by the GNER train, the 445 from Newcastle to London King's Cross. The train, as far as we can establish, became derailed, moved across and hit an oncoming freight train which was containing a huge amount of coal. A tremendous amount of wreckage, a very high-speed impact. We believe the train was doing 120 miles an hour. That's the GNER train, and the other train was doing about 70, so a huge impact of about 200 miles an hour. We know there are 13 people dead, and you've already described the numbers of injured, but there's still 13 dead. Our priority is to get those bodies away from the wreckage and get them identified as soon as possible. We are very much aware there's a huge number of people waiting very anxiously to hear whether one of their loved ones has been killed or not.
Now, we know there was a tyre blowout is what caused the car accident, but how was the vehicle able to leave the road and end up on the railway line?
Well, that's part of the investigation, but it certainly bypassed the crash barrier that protects the approach to the railway bridge. That's subject to the investigation, but it went down very, very quickly, and the driver rang the emergency services. As soon as he got down onto the track, he was uninjured, but sadly that was too late. The train was on the wreckage straight away on the train, and the collision occurred.
The police have been interviewing that driver this afternoon. Has he been able to help you with how this occurred?
Yes, he has been able to help us, but obviously at this stage it would be inappropriate for me to make any comment, but that inquiry goes on. But our priority here at the scene is to recover those bodies as soon as we can. It's going to be a slow and difficult task. It's very cold, it's very wet, we've got the emergency lighting on. It's going to take some time, and to say as soon as we can we will get the people out and get them identified.
All right, Superintendent, thank you very much. And from here in Great Heck, back to you, John.
Sarah, the police have issued an emergency telephone number for those who believe friends or relatives may have been involved in the crash. It is 020 7834 7777. That's 020 7834 7777. And on our website there are graphics analysing what happened, a full rundown of the day's events, and details of the hospitals where casualties have been taken. So a bizarre and horrific accident, but surely just that, an accident. Questions are being asked, however, about safety measures on the motorway above the line. The Highways Agency has revealed that the Land Rover missed the crash barrier altogether, as you heard in that report just now. Julian Rush has been investigating what happened and why.
There is a general consensus tonight that this was an accident. Awful, terrible, 1 in a million perhaps, but this time Britain's railway is unlikely to have to face the searing scrutiny it endured in the wake of Southall, Paddington and Hatfield.
This is a road accident that has caused a rail disaster. Clearly, there was very little that the railway could have done to prevent this accident, but there are probably things that the Highways Agency, which is responsible for this road, could have done to prevent it.
That means the crash barriers on and before the motorway bridge. Attention must focus on their strength, and more particularly their extent, for it seems the Land Rover left the road here before the bridge barrier begins. This bridge had the standard 30 metres of barrier either side. Is it enough? In the last 3 years, 29 road vehicles have come off bridges or embankments to end up on the tracks. In only 2 cases were they hit by a train and no one was killed.
This sort of accident is very rare. If that vehicle had fallen in front of the train and the train had hit it, had the freight train been further away, say a mile away only, then of course signals would have been replaced to danger and the freight train would have stopped. There is always a point at which you are beyond the braking arrangements of the train. In other words, it was so close that the tragedy happened.
One railway issue will feature in the report ordered by John Prescott. As a matter of routine, health and safety investigators will examine the crashworthiness of the coaches. But this was Mark IV stock, only 10 years old, some of the most modern on the railway. Its construction as a steel tube reckoned the safest around. Experts say the miracle is so many survived.
It's possible these trains met at a combined speed of about 150 miles an hour. We don't know yet, but something in that order. Now just imagine a Boeing 747 just touched down at 150 miles an hour, runs head-on into another stationary aircraft on the runway. I don't think you'll be looking at 13 dead and 40 or 50 injured in that case.
The sadness on the railway is tinged with bitterness tonight too. Private bitterness that, unlike the other crashes, the words scene of crime haven't been used. Bitterness that the same questions that were asked then of train drivers' history or state of mind aren't apparently being asked of the Land Rover driver. That this will be dismissed and forgotten as a mere road accident from which few lessons need be learned.
Julian Rush. Now, within the last few moments, reports have been coming in of a strong earthquake in Seattle in the United States. The tremor, which lasted around 45 seconds, measured 6.2 on the Richter scale. The epicenter was around 30 miles from the city. Witnesses say the quake was strong enough to rattle buildings and cause superficial damage. There are no reports yet of any injuries. We'll bring you details as we get them. Now, is foot and mouth disease spiralling out of control? 8 more outbreaks have been confirmed today. Thousands of farms are under investigation. An hour ago, confirmation of the first case in Northern Ireland. The Ministry of Agriculture at the same time is investigating claims that one farmer in Cambridgeshire has been flouting emergency rules banning the movement of animals. Andrew Veach reports on the ever-deepening sense of crisis in the farm industry and the implications for the supplies of food.
Pig farmers are warning of massive overcrowding. Unless they can begin to move stock to abattoirs, there'll be an extra 250,000 pigs on Britain's farms by Friday, and they dare not put them outside because foot and mouth virus spreads on the wind.
Pig production is a continuous process, so we've got pigs being born the whole time. We're in crisis management at the moment. We would really like to be able to move some stock sometime next week. If we aren't able to do that, we shall have problems, and we shall have to be thinking about either euthanizing some pigs or moving them to outdoors with all the risks that poses.
And with
13 people have been killed and many more seriously injured in a rail crash in North Yorkshire.
At fault, a car on the tracks that derailed a high-speed passenger service which then collided with a freight train.
In other news, 10 more cases of foot and mouth. France says it'll destroy sheep which came into contact with British animals.
And a new era begins for England and Sven-Göran Eriksson. Hello, this is BBC News 24. I'm John Nicholson.
And I'm Carrie Gracie. Good evening. 13 people are now known to have died and dozens more injured in today's major rail crash in North Yorkshire. A high-speed passenger train collided head-on with a freight train on the East Coast main line at Great Heck near Selby. The collision happened after a Land Rover and trailer crashed off the M62 motorway onto the railway line. Its driver desperately tried to warn signalmen that the line was blocked, but the warning came too late.
The Newcastle to London Express hit the vehicles at 125 miles an hour. It was derailed but travelled upright for a quarter of a mile until a freight train travelling in the opposite direction and carrying 1,000 tonnes of coal smashed into it.
The 445 from Newcastle to King's Cross was carrying around 100 passengers when the crash happened. The train derailed after hitting a vehicle on the line. It was then hit by a freight train carrying 1,500 tonnes of coal. Fire crews were amongst the first to get to the crash site.
First fire crews that arrived on the scene found clearly a difficult situation. There were people wandering around, some people were injured, other people requiring urgent assistance.
The first 3 carriages were the worst hit. The front first-class carriage was thrown so far from the tracks it came to rest in a field alongside the railway line. The coaches behind it crumpled into each other. Some of the injured were treated at the scene by the emergency services. Helicopters were flown in to take those who were seriously hurt to hospitals in the area. A freak sequence of events led to the accident near Selby in North Yorkshire, where the M62 crosses the East Coast line. A Land Rover towing a car on a trailer ploughed off the motorway and onto the railway line.
What we do know is that a road vehicle appears to have left the M62 motorway. That has been in turn run into by a GNER passenger train, which has then become derailed and travelled for some quarter of a mile down the East Coast main line before colliding with a Freightliner train travelling in the north direction.
The emergency services worked for several hours checking the carriages for survivors, but this evening they began removing bodies from the wreckage. The line remains blocked at the accident site while investigations continue. Rail services are severely disrupted and GNER are advising people not to travel to and from the region. Kim Barnes, BBC News.
The injured passengers were taken to a number of hospitals throughout Yorkshire where doctors reported some critical injuries and provided urgent surgery. Around 30 of the wounded were taken to Pontefract, where some have been speaking about their experiences.
Throughout the morning and at times working in terrible weather, a fleet of helicopters and ambulances transported the injured to hospitals across Yorkshire. Some were luckier than others and after treatment could go home.
To be honest, I can't remember a huge amount. I just remember that sound like there was someone throwing stones over the train, and then you could feel it go off the rails, and then to be honest, I can't remember anything after that until I was standing on the track.
Relatives of the victim say the injured are deeply upset by the crash.
Just seen a lot of people injured today, and should have been out of us gear. I think that's the reality of it. She could just as easily be dead now, or badly injured.
Many of the victims were far more badly hurt. More than 30 were taken to Pontefract Hospital, just a few miles from the scene of the crash. The victims had a variety of injuries, some of them very serious. At least 2 needed surgery.
I think every patient we had here was able to indicate to some degree how they were feeling. Most were obviously very shaken and very upset, as perhaps you can imagine.
Some patients clearly required specialist treatment for head and spinal injuries, and they were transferred to other hospitals. Many, though, are still too ill to be allowed home and will need medical treatment for some days to come. Catherine Marston, BBC News, Pontefract.
Well, earlier I spoke to our correspondent Catherine Marston, who is at Pontefract General Infirmary, and she told me about the latest about the casualties.
31, as I said in that report, that were initially brought here to Pontefract Infirmary. Of course, many people were taken to other hospitals across this county. But of those that were brought here, there are now 16 remaining. The others have been treated and discharged. Of the 16 who are still here, we understand that 8 have what's been described as life-threatening injuries. Although the hospital tell us all of those 8 have now been stabilised, they are still, though, very poorly. One person is in intensive care and will remain there for the foreseeable future. Another person, we understand, is to be transferred to a hospital in Leeds later on tonight. Yvette Cooper, the Minister for Health, who's also a local MP, is due to visit the hospital within the next few minutes. She's coming here to talk to the victims and their families.
Catherine, do we know the sorts of injuries that people are being treated for and detained for at the hospital?
Well, it's a variety, and you will have heard it throughout reports this evening that in some hospitals, particularly York, it was really just the walking wounded, people with scratches, bumps, smaller injuries that just needed minor treatment, then they could go home. The sorts of injuries for the people, the 16 for instance, that are still here are much, much more serious. We're talking about internal injuries. We know one person has had such severe internal injuries they've had to have surgery. Others have very serious injuries, for instance, to their chest, then to their head, and also spinal injuries. Some of these require specialist treatment in specialist units around in other hospitals, and they have subsequently been transferred to receive that specialised medical care. The majority of people that are still here, though, still have very serious injuries, and the hospitals say that they will be expected to stay in hospital for at least the next few days.
Catherine Marston. Well, live now to the scene of the crash, and our correspondent Kevin Bouquet. Kevin, of course, one of the abiding mysteries of today is how that Land Rover, why that Land Rover travelled all the way down the embankment and onto the railway line. Can you shed any more light on that this evening?
Well, no, the mystery is simply getting deeper. We discovered from John Prescott's statement at the Commons an hour ago something we didn't know before, which is that after leaving the motorway, this Land Rover and trailer travelled 100 metres across a field and down an embankment to a railway line. It seems quite incredible that it would travel that far, that it couldn't be stopped for some reason, that it didn't run into a tree or a bush or a ditch or anything, but that it managed to get all the way down to the railway line. And then, of course, there was this extraordinary sequence of events, coincidences really. There just happened to be a high-speed express heading south at the time. There just happened to be a freight train carrying coal heading north, and the whole lot collided with the disastrous consequences that we've seen.
And that we can still see behind you. What is actually going on there this evening at the crash site?
Well, to be honest, I'm not sure. There has been work going on in the last couple of hours since it got dark. They've been working under arc lights, and literally within the last couple of minutes behind me you might be able to see a digger has started work. I'm not too sure what exactly it's doing, whether or not they've actually begun the work of clearing away wreckage yet, but what we understood that they were doing in this last couple of hours was removing the bodies of the 13 people known to have died in this accident. There are concerns that the death toll might rise, and the reason is that the wreckage of the train, it is so tangled that they simply won't know until they clear all of it whether there could be some more bodies there. But hopefully that situation will become clearer tomorrow.
So they're still unable to account for all the passengers who were on the train this morning, or unable to number the passengers?
No, that's the point. It's not a question of accounting for them, it's a question of numbering them, knowing how many there were. I mean, the rail authorities, the rail companies, GNER, they take bookings for these services, but by no means all the people who book seats turn up. And then an awful lot more people who didn't book seats do turn up, and so in other words, you simply don't know who is on the train, how many people are on the train. The best estimate that they've been able to give is more than 100, possibly getting on for 200, but nobody knows who was on the train, how many were on the train, so it's not like when you lose an aircraft and you have a very detailed account of who's actually sitting in which seat. It's not the same with trains. They don't know how many people they're trying to account for.
And to return to the work going on there this evening, it is, of course, a very delicate process, isn't it? Because there's the problem of not disturbing evidence.
Well, that's right, because there has to be an inquiry into what happened. You heard John Prescott say that the Health and Safety Executive have been asked to produce a report within a couple of days, and as they work their way through the wreckage,
of the train. They are not just recovering bodies, but they are also trying to gather evidence, trying to preserve evidence, and that's very, very difficult, especially given the conditions in which they're working. Not only is it dark, but it's very, very cold. The ground is, it's not good, it's very soft, there's been snow today, but nevertheless they're pressing on with it, making what progress they can.
Kevin, for now, thank you very much.
The Selby crash is being investigated by the Health and Safety Executive as well as British Transport Police. Meanwhile, the Highways Agency has said that crash barriers on the motorway bridge at the site of this morning's disaster are undamaged. Experts say that suggests that the Land Rover at the centre of the incident left the road and plunged down the embankment at a point before the crash barriers started.
The rail industry was just beginning to win back passenger confidence following the Hatfield derailment, but today accident investigators are once again left with the appalling task of trying to establish the cause of this latest crash. This time it appears it was the result of a devastating sequence of coincidences. A Land Rover towing a trailer with an empty car on top veered off the westbound M62 and ended up on the track of the East Coast Main Line. The driver tried to warn the police, but it was too late. The Newcastle to London Express hit the vehicles at 125 miles an hour. Carriages were derailed into the path of the freight train travelling north.
Potentially, this could turn out to be the highest speed crash recorded anywhere, even overtopping Ladbroke Grove of 18 months ago, which we know was the highest collision speed in World Railway history. These two trains had a potential combined speed of about 185, 190 miles an hour.
It appears the car and trailer left the road before reaching high-impact crash barriers protecting the bridge. GNER says that needs to be investigated.
How it is possible for a vehicle to come off a motorway and come onto the road, it's got to be investigated. It should not happen. But tragically, our train coming towards it at 125 miles an hour hit it, stayed upright, got derailed, but stayed upright, which is what it's meant to do, stayed coupled, went along. The driver had obviously seen it because the brakes have been applied before, but we're travelling at 2 miles a minute at that stage.
The Deputy Prime Minister visited the scene this afternoon. He paid tribute to the emergency services and expressed his deepest sympathies to the relatives of those who died. This evening, Mr. Prescott told the House of Commons there would be the fullest investigation.
There are a number of agencies involved in this: the Health and Safety Executive, the Railway Inspectorate, the British Transport and North Yorkshire Police, and indeed the Highways Agency. All of them will be conducting their own investigation. I've asked the Health and Safety Executive, therefore, to provide me with an interim report within the next few days. I shall then make a decision as to what further steps may be appropriate, and I shall assure that the report is made public.
Outlining the sequence of events, Mr. Prescott said there had been just 40 seconds between the Land Rover driver's call to the police and the first impact. The car and trailer are thought to have travelled more than 100 metres from the road before coming to rest on the rails. The Highways Agency says the motorway bridge was protected by standard 30-metre crash barriers, which appear to have been undamaged. Investigators will now have to establish exactly how a relatively minor traffic accident led to such devastation. Daniel Bircher, BBC News.
A short while ago, I spoke to our correspondent Duncan Kennedy, who's in the village of Snaith, near the crash site, where a church service is being held. I asked him to describe the mood.
It is a difficult mood, a sombre mood indeed. It was a pre-planned service. It is Ash Wednesday today, and the service would have been held anyway, but it's taken on a completely different complexion as a result of the tragic events just down the road here. The ordinary vicar, Cyril Roberts, has decided to give way to the actual Bishop of Doncaster, who will now be leading the service. He wasn't due to give the service here tonight, but he thought, in the light of circumstances, he'd better come down and conduct the service here. That's the Right Reverend Cyril Ashton. He'll be conducting about an hour-long service, service of communion with hymns and prayers. He himself will be talking about his praise for the emergency services, and he'll also be calling for prayers for the bereaved and for the victims who are still in hospital. And he'll be specifically quoting from the Bible, one of the Beatitudes, in fact. One of the things he told me just a couple of minutes ago before the service started, that he'll be saying that he'll be calling for those who are blessed to mourn because they shall be comforted. Just one of the things that he'll be calling on his congregation to do. He says this whole service was pre-planned, but I think its nature will change, its tone will change, bearing in mind the events that happened just a few hours ago, and bearing in mind the impact it's having not only on this community here in Snaith, but right across the whole of North Yorkshire and into the East Riding of Yorkshire.
Now, as the Prime Minister expressed in the Commons this afternoon, the local community have obviously been incredibly helpful in terms of feeding the emergency services, in terms of helping in every way that they can. But of course, by now, this evening, the shock of what's actually happened must be sinking in.
Yes, I suppose it is sinking in, but people here are still reeling from this event. I spoke to the vicar, Mr. Roberts, a little earlier. I've spoken to him throughout the day, actually. I keep bumping into him. And he says he just can't come to terms with what's gone on here today. And you get the same impression from all the people you speak to here. Very small little villages in a beautiful part of the world. And all of a sudden you've got these grotesque images of twisted train metal just on their doorstep. And people here just can't come to terms with that. You're quite right. Many of them were up very early this morning, not least those people right next to where the accident happened. One or two of them thought there'd been a chemical spillage because they saw the blue lights of a fire engine go past their house. They ended up helping. They ended up taking out the teas on the trays, providing the bacon sandwiches for these emergency services. All manner of people who wouldn't normally have anything to do with these kinds of incidents have been caught up in this. And yes, they are reeling from the shock and only just at this moment trying to come to terms with it.
Duncan Kennedy, British Transport Police have issued an emergency number for anyone concerned about friends or relatives. It's 020-7834-7777. That's 020-7834-7777.
Time now for the headlines at 17 minutes past 8. 13 passengers have been killed and many more are seriously injured after a train crash on the East Coast Main Line in North Yorkshire.
After hitting a car on the track, the high-speed GNER service from Newcastle to London collided with a freight train.
In other news tonight, the foot and mouth outbreak is feared to have spread to Northern Ireland, bringing the number of confirmed new cases today to 10.
This is BBC News 24, still to come. Earthquake in Seattle. The Pacific City is shaken, causing damage and disruption.
First though, let's catch up on the sports headlines with Adnan.
People call it Jambulayaya. It means the rain. The news never stops happening. BBC News 24 brings you the latest news. 24 hours a day, whenever and wherever you want it.
And now for the rest of today's top news stories.
Now on BBC One, a special edition of the 10 o'clock news with Peter Sissons and Peter Lugg.
Another rail tragedy. 13 people lose their lives. A freak accident, 2 trains and a few lethal seconds. How could a car and trailer crash onto a busy main line? Foot and mouth's grim advance. It's now spread to Northern Ireland. And England's first goal under new management.
Tonight, the inside story of the East Coast train crash that left 13 dead and many more injured. In 25 minutes, a special programme telling what happened and asking what lessons can be learned for the future.
Good evening. Britain's railway, barely recovered from disasters of its own making, was struck today by a bizarre accident completely outside its control. It turned a stretch of high-speed line in North Yorkshire into a scene of devastation and left people dead and 70 injured, some of them tonight fighting for their lives. It took just a minute or two for the horrific sequence of events at Great Heck near Selby to unfold. Shortly after 6 o'clock this morning, a Land Rover towing a car on a trailer plunged off the M62 motorway onto the East Coast Main Line. A GNER Express travelling from Newcastle to London then ploughed into the vehicles at high speed. That derailed the passenger train, which was then struck by a freight train coming the other way. From the scene, our chief news correspondent, Kate Adey, reports.
400 tons of Intercity Express derailed, then smashed, as it hurtled through North Yorkshire at 125 miles an hour. An accident of extraordinary coincidence. A 36-year-old man was towing a car on a trailer when it slid off the M62 motorway, down onto the main East Coast line. The car driver escaped serious injury, and while calling the police, saw the express coming. The intercity driver, who died, would have had only seconds before the impact. All 11 carriages came off the track, juddering and careering, only to be ripped into by a freight train coming the other way.
It seemed as though there was something underneath the carriage, dragging on underneath the carriage. And then all the glass in the windows shattered and the glass was flying about. And something must have hit the carriage on the side, because on the right-hand side going south, the seats were torn out and into the aisle.
Both trains were partially under a bridge. It was dark, just after 6 a.m., and local residents were soon there.
There's a lot of diesel about. One of the things that surprised me was there's even diesel up on the top of the bridge here. It was absolutely soaked in diesel when I came across. The whole thing's just an absolute carnage. I personally cannot believe how a train can disintegrate into so many pieces. It is absolutely incredible.
Many of the passengers managed to get themselves out, but at least 30 had to be cut free, though it took 7 hours, amid a jumble of wreckage and tons of coal from the freight train.
There was quite a number of people just dazed walking around. They got themselves off the train and they're walking around in a fairly dazed state. We managed to gather them all together and put them into a holding area, which was one of the farmers' sheds here. We then searched the sides of the track up and down about 200 metres in front and behind the train to make sure nobody had wandered away and fell into ditches and things. So that was the scene when we first arrived. It was absolute chaos.
RAF helicopters took the most seriously injured to Hull and Leeds, headed for these and 3 other hospitals. Pontefract General Infirmary took in 30 people, 2 needing immediate surgery, and others then transferring for specialist treatment. A number were able to leave.
To be honest, I can't remember a huge amount. I just remember that it sounded like there was some like sort of throwing stones over the train, and then you could feel it go off the rails, and then to be honest, I can't remember anything after that until I was standing on the track.
Throughout, there was no panic, just immense shock and confusion amid a major rescue operation.
The scene was a whole mixture of emotion, great shock, but also a calmness and a purpose of working. I can't pay enough tribute to the team of emergency service people who have helped the injured and done it with such great care and compassion and concern and marvellous efficiency.
The Queen sent a message of sympathy, and the Deputy Prime Minister John Prescott was on the scene by lunchtime as the rescue effort came to the point where there were no further survivors to be found amid the sprawl of wreckage spilling over into the muddy fields in the freezing cold. As darkness fell, the detailed search and inspection of the area ceased, but the job of retrieving bodies from the wreckage goes on. Not an easy task, and one which is likely to continue well into tomorrow. But it'll only be when heavy lifting gear is in operation to clear the badly mangled front carriages that the death toll can be confirmed.
An accident which it seems could not have been foreseen. 2 cars tumbling from above in the dark onto a railway track between 2 oncoming trains. Kate Adey, BBC News, North Yorkshire.
Several investigations into what happened have already begun. One of the key questions, how it was possible for a vehicle to get round a motorway safety barrier and onto the railway track. Our transport correspondent Simon Montague reports.
For the investigators, the clues as to how the Land Rover, its trailer and the empty car landed here lie on the motorway above. Beside the hard shoulder, you can see the tyre marks in the grass. And travelling along, you realise the vehicles were already halfway down the embankment before the start of the barrier that's supposed to protect the railway line. Why the Land Rover left the road isn't clear. A tyre blowout's been suggested, but the police say they've no evidence yet as to the reason. Where the motorway crosses the railway, the tracks are protected by a 30-metre crash barrier. The Land Rover was heading west. It left the motorway and slid onto the track. The driver called for help, but the passenger train was already approaching. It hit the Land Rover and was derailed, but continued for half a mile before hitting a set of points. That pushed it into the path of a freight train coming the other way. For GNER, it's the second disaster in 5 months. One of the locomotives here was in the Hatfield crash as well, and once again it wasn't the company's fault.
How it's possible for a vehicle to come off a motorway and come onto the road, it's got to be investigated. It should not happen. Our job is to make the railways safe, and after Hatfield we have worked so hard to make the railways safe, and we continue to work to make the railways safe. If there was something like this to happen, that's got to be looked at and investigated.
And tonight the Deputy Prime Minister promised the fullest possible investigation.
I've asked the Health and Safety Executive, therefore, to provide me with an interim report within the next few days. I shall then make a decision as to what further steps may be appropriate, and I shall assure that the report is made public.
Mr. Prescott said the investigation would look at the motorway safety barrier. The Highways Agency in charge of motorways said it did meet current design standards. Some question whether the standards might need to be changed.
Clearly this is a road accident that caused a rail disaster. Clearly it is to the Highways Agency, which is responsible for the roads, that we must look to answers about why, for example, there wasn't a long enough barrier to prevent this accident.
With organisations involved in highways, rail safety and accident reconstruction at the scene, plus 2 police forces, there's a total of 5 separate investigations going on. It'll take several months to work out how all this happened. Simon Montague, BBC News.
Joining me now from one of the hospitals treating the injured is Catherine Marston, but first from the site of the crash, Kate Adie. Kate, how would you describe the scene there tonight?
It's very busy. As you can probably hear, there are diggers working behind me. The arc lights are here, the generators going, because what they're trying to do is create a temporary roadway so heavy lifting gear can be brought in. And on top of that, there's a great deal of activity in the actual crash area, where they are still sifting through the wreckage, trying to find the bodies and bring them out, because no formal identification has yet taken place. One point the police have made, for those people who actually reported friends or relatives missing, if those people have turned up safely at home or are known to be in hospital, could they possibly contact the police? So far, there is no formal identification, and it will help if people do that.
Thank you, Kate. And Catherine Marston is at the hospital at Pontefract. What news tonight, Catherine, on the many people who were hurt in this crash?
Well, of the 15 victims that were brought here to Pontefract Infirmary and still are here, 2 men are critically ill in intensive care. The first has collapsed lungs caused by the impact of the crash, and the second has internal bleeding in his stomach. He's had to undergo surgery this afternoon for that. The consultant charged with their care tells us the next 24 hours are crucial for both men. A third man has recently been transferred to a specialist neurological unit. He has a fractured skull. He'll also need plastic surgery on his hands for fractures caused by the crash. Of the other people remaining here, the majority have fractures and also serious cuts to their heads. They're all being closely observed. Hospital staff say some of them may be allowed to go home tomorrow, but the 2 men who are in intensive care will remain at this hospital for some time to come.
Catherine Marston and Kate Adie too. Thank you. And viewers in the north-east and Cumbria can see a special programme on the Selby crash immediately following this news. It appears that foot and mouth disease has crossed the Irish Sea, with a farm in Northern Ireland now reported to have the disease. Across Britain, 8 new cases have brought the total to 26 confirmed outbreaks. The chief vet says 15,000 animals are being slaughtered to try to contain the outbreak. The area covered by the outbreak is widening. It now includes Leicestershire and Powys in mid-Wales. And there are further outbreaks in Herefordshire, Lancashire, Essex and Devon.
It was at this farm in South Armagh that the latest blow to British farming was delivered. Foot and mouth has now crossed the Irish Sea. In recent days, ministers here have been arguing that the restrictions on animal movement should be lifted because they said Northern Ireland was free of the disease. Tests tonight show they were wrong.
I can confirm that on examination at slaughter, some of the sheep presented symptoms which are consistent with foot and mouth disease. I have to tell you that it is now my belief that we are looking at an outbreak of this disease in Northern Ireland.
Tonight there are 400 extra Irish border police in place. They don't want illegally imported animals to shift the disease south. This is a terrible blow to farmers here. Supermarkets had hoped, if there was a shortage, to turn to Irish beef from both sides of the border. In Wales, the disease is already established. Now it is the spread that frightens. On the Menai Straits Bridge, every car into Anglesey now goes over a disinfected mat. Few communities can now feel safe. On the bleak, snow-swept hills of Powys, they hoped isolation would give some protection, but they are as vulnerable as any, and today, another family caught up in the crisis.
I think it is the killing and the burning. It's going to be the worst of all things. Digging a trench and putting your stuff that you've struggled to get up through, isn't it? It's your livelihood gone.
There is almost paranoia in the countryside about the spread of this disease. The smell of disinfectant air around farms. Britain continues to close itself down, and tonight the calls to leave the country alone received royal support.
I feel I must just add my own plea that everyone should try and do everything they can to avoid unnecessary movement around the countryside, to avoid spreading this highly contagious disease.
And this is the horrible reality of this disease. Foot and mouth was confirmed on this farm in Northamptonshire yesterday. Today the farmer slaughtered every animal. You can't honestly imagine it, you know, just dead shape and, you know, it's horrible, it really is. With every day of new confirmed cases, the fear in the British countryside continues to grow. Every farmer is concerned that they will be the next victim, that they will have to spend a terrible day destroying their livelihoods